The sky over Ashenvale didn't just rain, it mourned. I watched through the fogged glass of the private jet as the wheels touched down on the runway my father had built, on the land my family had owned for 3 centuries. Now, it was just another line item on a foreclosure list. My wrists ached under the cold hum of suppressor cuffs, the blue light a constant reminder that to the world, I was a defective beta, a glitch in the pack's pure bloodline. The door hissed open, and the scent of expensive cologne and damp earth hit me. Before I could find my footing, a hand like a vice gripped my shoulder. Garrett Bonecrusher didn't lead me down the steps, he threw me. I hit the mud at the feet of a man whose shoes cost more than my family's remaining pride. Matthias Silvermane didn't look at my face. He looked at the deed in his hand, his amber eyes glowing with a predatory, corporate coldness. "Clean her up," he muttered to the enforcer, turning his back on my shivering form. "She's the only part of this property I haven't renovated yet." I lay there, the taste of copper in my mouth and a strange, dark heat beginning to thrum deep in my marrow, a pulse they aren't prepared for. Bringing these hidden Wolfverse stories to life takes weeks of scripting and deep-dive research into pack lore. If you believe Rosalind deserves justice, it would mean the world to have you join our pack by following the journey below. The transition from heiress to housemaid was a silent, agonizing blur. While the Ashenvale estate buzzed with the preparations for Matthias's upcoming merger, I was relegated to the dust-choked corners of the West Wing. Every time I scrubbed the marble floors, the cold stone triggered memories of the day my world fractured. I was 12 years old, standing in the center of the pack infirmary, my skin burning with a fever that felt like molten lead. My brothers, Julian and Silas, stood by the door, their forms already broad and powerful. They had shifted early, their wolves fierce and celebrated. But when the pack doctor pressed the diagnostic crystal to my chest, it didn't glow with the steady green of a healthy beta or the golden hue of an alpha. It turned a muddy, flickering gray. "Dormant," the doctor had whispered, recoiling as if the crystal had burnt him. "Her spirit is a void. Spiritually defective." Julian's snicker had been sharp as a blade. "A hollow Ashwood? She's not a wolf, father. She's a parasitic beta." My father hadn't defended me. He didn't even look at me. He simply turned his back, his shoulders slumped in a shame more suffocating than the fever. "She will not represent this house," he decreed. From that day on, I wasn't a daughter. I was a ghost in my own home, a mistake hidden behind velvet curtains until Matthias Silvermane finally pulled them down. Now, as a servant in the Silvermane household, the fever was returning. It wasn't an illness. It was a rhythmic thrumming in my veins that intensified whenever I felt the sting of Isadora's insults. The library, Ashwood. "Move," Garrett's voice boomed, jolting me back to the present. "The Alpha wants the archives organized before the High Council arrives. And don't touch the first editions with your filthy hands." The library was a cathedral of leather and oak, smelling of ancient secrets. It was there, tucked away in the restricted genealogy section, that I found him. Felix Wilehart was hunched over a trellis of ivy just outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, his shears snicking with rhythmic precision. He looked like a simple gardener, but when he caught my eye, his gaze held the weight of centuries. "You're vibrating, child," he said, his voice a low gravel. He didn't look at my servant's uniform. He looked at the black, web-like veins momentarily flickering beneath the skin of my wrists. "I'm just tired," I lied, pulling my sleeves down. Felix stepped through the garden doors, dropping a handful of nightshade onto a mahogany table. "The doctors called it a defect because they fear what they cannot categorize. They wanted a submissive beta, but the moon gave them a moon-eater." My heart hammered against my ribs. "What are you talking about?" "The obsidian pulse," Felix whispered, stepping closer. "It hasn't manifested in a female since the Great Schism. It is an alpha energy so dense it swallows the light of others. The council spent generations trying to purge it from the bloodlines, calling it a curse to justify their executions. You aren't hollow, Rosalind. You're a vessel that's finally reaching its limit." I backed away, terrified by the hunger in his eyes. Matthias bought me because I'm a beta. If he finds out. Matthias is the least of your concerns, Felix interrupted, pointing toward the grand foyer. Through the library's cracked door, I saw them. High Alpha Octavius Blackwater had arrived, flanked by 6 enforcers in silver-plated armor. He was the law of the Northern Territories, a man who believed in the absolute purity of the wolf. Matthias met him in the hall, his posture rigid. Even from a distance, the tension was palpable. Octavius's voice carried a chilling, melodic edge. The silver main line is the backbone of our economy, Matthias. But a backbone without a successor is brittle. Isadora is a fine Luna, but the council is losing patience. Produce a pureblood heir by the next blood moon, or we will find a more fertile line to lead a Shenvale. Matthias's jaw tightened, his amber eyes flashing with a suppressed rage that matched the heat in my own blood. He was being squeezed by the same system that had discarded me. He needed a perfect heir to survive, and I was the defective property hidden in his shadows, carrying a power that could dismantle Octavius's entire world. Felix watched me watch them, a small, knowing smile tugging at his lips. The billionaire thinks he's playing a game of chess with the council. He has no idea he's brought a dragon into the counting house. As the High Alpha's laughter echoed through the manor, the pulse in my chest flared, a dark, silent heartbeat that promised to turn the Silver Mane Empire to ash. Do you think Felix is a trustworthy ally, or does he have his own agenda for the Moon Eater? The Eclipse Gala was a masterpiece of cruelty disguised as luxury. The grand ballroom of the Silver Mane estate was filled with the scent of gardenias and the predatory musk of the world's most powerful alphas. I moved through the crowd like a shadow, clad in the drab gray of a servant, carrying a silver tray of vintage champagne that felt heavier with every step. My wrists, still bound by the suppressor cuffs, throbbed in time with the dark heat growing in my chest. Isadora stood at the center of the room, draped in silk the color of a fresh bruise. She caught my eye, a malicious glint reflecting off her diamond choker. As I approached to refresh the High Alpha's glass, her foot shot out with calculated precision. The world tilted. The silver tray clattered against the marble, and a dozen crystal flutes shattered into 1,000 jagged diamonds. I hit the floor hard, the sharp stabs of glass piercing the skin of my palms and knees. Silence rippled outward from the crash, replaced quickly by the low, rumbling laughter of men who viewed my pain as a dinner performance. Careless, even for a defective, Isadora purred, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. She looked up at Octavius Blackwater, who was watching me with the detached interest one might show a crushed insect. My apologies, High Alpha. It's hard to find good help when they lack the basic instincts of a wolf. Don't apologize, Isadora, Octavius replied, his voice a cold blade. He looked down at me, his lip curling. The girl is a reminder of what happens when the blood goes thin. Clean it up, Ashwood. On your knees. It's the only position that suits you. I looked up, my vision blurring with tears of rage. I caught Matthias's gaze. He was standing by the fireplace, his knuckles white as he gripped his own glass. For a second, I saw a flash of something pity, regret, before he masked it with his usual mask of billionaire indifference. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He let me bleed in front of his peers. By the time I was dismissed to the stables to finish my chores, the dormant fire in my veins was no longer a flicker, it was a roaring furnace. The suppressor cuffs hummed violently, the blue light flickering as if struggling to contain the pressure. Still crying, little ghost? I spun around. Garrett Bonecrusher stood in the stable doorway, silhouetted by the moonlight. He held a silver-tipped training whip, its leather tail twitching like a snake. Matthias had sent him to discipline me for the embarrassment at the gala. Matthias didn't ask for this, I rasped, my voice sounding deeper, more resonant than I recognized. The Alpha doesn't need to ask for the trash to be taken out, Garrett sneered. He stepped forward, the whip whistling through the air. The first strike caught my shoulder, tearing through the thin fabric of my uniform. The pain was the final key. The black veins Felix had warned me about surged up my neck, visible even in the dark. As Garrett raised the whip for a second strike, I didn't cower. I screamed not a sound of pain, but a primal release of 3 centuries of repressed power. The obsidian pulse didn't just hit Garrett, it detonated. A wave of literal shadow erupted from my chest, a pressurized vacuum of black energy that turned the air to ice. Garrett was launched backward, his massive frame shattering the stable doors before he hit the stone perimeter wall with the force of a car crash. Then came the chain reaction. The energy surged into the estate's power lines. One by one, the grand chandeliers in the ballroom exploded. The high-tech security grids, the suppressed locks, the reinforced glass, everything shattered. The entire silver main estate plunged into a terrifying, absolute darkness. I stood in the center of the wreckage, my cuffs lying snapped on the straw-covered floor, their blue light extinguished forever. My hands were stained with my own blood and Garrett's, but they were glowing with a faint, obsidian smoke. The stable door groaned. Matthias stood there, a tactical flashlight in one hand, his shifted claws out. He swung the light toward me, and for the first time since he bought me, the arrogance was gone. His amber eyes were wide, reflecting a primitive, bone-deep terror. He didn't see a servant or a defective beta. He saw a predator that made his own alpha status look like a toy. "Rosalind," he whispered, his voice trembling. What are you?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. The world was no longer a story about a girl being bullied by billionaires. The shadows around us were moving, responding to my breath, and the ancient mystery of the Moon Eater had finally stepped out of the library and into the light. The darkness following the blackout was absolute, save for the obsidian smoke still curling from my fingertips. Matthias didn't call for the guards. He didn't reach for his phone to alert the council. Instead, he grabbed my arm, his grip surprisingly gentle, and pulled me through a hidden service corridor that led directly to his private study. Inside, the room was a fortress of mahogany and silence. He locked the heavy oak door and leaned against it, his chest heaving. The flashlight on his desk flickered, casting long, jagged shadows against the walls. For minutes, neither of us spoke. The silence was a living thing, heavy with the weight of the stable doors I had just turned into splinters. "I should turn you over to Octavius," Matthias said finally, though his voice lacked its usual billionaire bite. "What you just did, it's a death sentence. The council doesn't permit anomalies. They certainly don't permit female alphas." "Then do it," I challenged, stepping into the light. The black veins were receding, leaving my skin pale and cold. "Hand me over. End the renovation project once and for all." Matthias turned away, his fingers fumbling with the buttons of his dress shirt. With a frustrated growl, he pulled the silk garment off, tossing it onto a leather chair. I gasped, the air catching in my throat. His back was a roadmap of agony. Thick, silver keloid scars crisscrossed his skin, some looking like they had been carved by claws, others like the jagged remnants of chemical burns. "My father didn't want an heir," Matthias whispered, his back still turned to me. He wanted a weapon. Every time I failed to shift on command, every time I showed beta mercy, he used silver-tipped rods to remind me what an alpha is supposed to be. He burned the weakness out of me until I was as cold as the currency I deal in. He turned around, his amber eyes wet with a vulnerability he had never shown the world. "I didn't buy you to own you, Rosalind. I bought you because if I hadn't, Octavius would have sent you to the dormant reclamation labs. I knew you were different. I just didn't know you were the end of the world." For a moment, the billionaire facade vanished. We weren't alpha and servant. We were just two broken things trying to survive a system built to crush us. This was our sanctuary, a fragile peace forged in the shadow of shared trauma. But the peace was short-lived. A faint scratching sound came from the ventilation duct near the ceiling, a rhythmic tapping I recognized from my time cleaning the manor. It was the signal Felix had mentioned, a way for the invisible staff to communicate. I signaled Matthias to stay quiet and moved toward the window that overlooked the rear terrace. Below us, partially hidden by the overgrown ivy of the west wing, stood Isadora. She wasn't alone. Standing opposite her was a massive, scarred wolf whose fur was the color of dried blood, a rogue dark fur messenger. "The vault codes are updated," Isadora hissed, her voice sharp enough to cut the night air. She handed a small encrypted drive to the rogue. "Matthias is distracted by his new pet. When the moon eclipses tomorrow, the security grid will stay down. Tell Darkfur I want the silver mane head on a pike, and the estate belongs to me." The messenger let out a low, guttural growl of agreement before vanishing into the tree line. I turned back to Matthias, my blood turning to ice. "She's selling you out. Isadora, she's working with the rogues. She's giving them the vault, the pack, everything." Matthias's expression didn't shift into rage. It shifted into a horrifying, hollow kind of grief. He slumped into his desk chair, his head in his hands. "I know," he whispered. "You know?" I nearly screamed. "Matthias, they're coming to kill you. They're coming to slaughter the Ashenvale pack. You have to move. You have to alert the enforcers." "And tell them what?" Matthias snapped, looking up. "That the Luna I handpicked to stabilize this pack is a traitor? If I move against her without the Council's blessing, Octavius will use it as an excuse to seize my assets and liquidate everyone under my protection. Especially you. So you're just going to let her do it?" I stepped toward him, the obsidian pulse humming beneath my skin again, fed by my disbelief. "You're going to let the empire you bought me to protect burn down around us? I'm trying to find a way where you don't end up on a laboratory table, Rosalind." He stood up, closing the distance between us until I could feel the heat radiating from his scarred chest. "Isadora is a Silvermane by law. You are my property. If I choose you over her, I lose the legal standing to protect you from the High Alpha. I am trying to save your life, even if it costs me my own." The conflict hung between us like a drawn sword. He was torn between the woman he was legally bound to and the defective girl who represented everything he had ever truly wanted: freedom. I saw the calculation in his eyes, the billionaire trying to find a loophole in a prophecy written in blood. He was still trying to buy a future, but the rogues weren't interested in a deal. As the first light of dawn began to gray the horizon, I realized that the sanctuary of the study was an illusion. The shadow of the Alpha was long, but the shadow of the Moon Eater was beginning to eclipse it. Can Matthias ever truly be redeemed for buying her, or is he just as bad as the rest? The eclipse arrived not as a celestial wonder, but as a shroud. As the moon's shadow began to bite into the sun, the estate's secondary power grid, the one Isadora had compromised, hissed into silence. In that unnatural twilight, the first howl went up. It wasn't the disciplined call of an Ashenvale sentry, it was the ragged, bloodthirsty shriek of the Darfur rogues. The siege was instantaneous. The reinforced glass of the Grand Conservatory shattered under the weight of a dozen massive, mangy wolves. Alarms that should have blared remained silent. Sentries who should have been at their posts were found slumped in the corridors, victims of the same inner circle betrayal that now reached for Matthias's throat. Inside the private study, Matthias suddenly buckled, his hand clutching his throat. His skin turned a sickly, translucent gray, and dark violet veins began to spiderweb across his jaw. "The scotch," he wheezed, collapsing against the mahogany desk. "Isadora, Wolfsbane." I rushed to him, but the door was kicked off its hinges before I could reach his side. It wasn't the rogues. It was High Alpha Octavius Blackwater, looking immaculate even as screams echoed from the hallway. Behind him, two enforcers carried a shimmering, heavy structure of liquid silver bars, a containment unit designed for high-level supernatural threats. "A tragic night," Octavius said, his voice smooth as silk. He didn't spare a glance for the dying Matthias. His eyes were fixed on me. The billionaire falls to a rogue coup, and the defective girl is revealed as the monster who caused it all. It's a clean narrative, don't you think? "He's dying," I screamed, lunging for Octavius. The enforcers were faster. They didn't strike me. They used a high-frequency sonic emitter that sent me to my knees, my head feeling like it was being split by a hot iron. Before I could recover, they shoved me into the silver cage. The bars hummed with a specialized current that interacted with the suppressor salts in my blood, paralyzing my will. "You aren't a guest anymore, Rosalind," Octavius whispered, leaning down to the bars. "You are an asset. I'm going to watch you burn the rogues, then I'm going to take you back to the council labs to see exactly how your marrow produces that obsidian pulse." Through the shimmering bars of my prison, I watched the horror unfold. The study doors were thrown open again, and Rogue Darkfur himself prowled in, a behemoth of a wolf, his fur matted with the blood of Matthias's guards. He shifted into a hulking, scarred man, his eyes fixed on the paralyzed Alpha on the floor. "Silvermane," Darkfur growled, drawing a jagged obsidian blade. "The man who thought he could buy the wilderness. Your Luna sends her regards." Isadora stepped into the room, stepping over her husband's twitching legs to stand beside the rogue. "Do it," she commanded. "I want the deed signed in blood." Darkfur raised the blade over Matthias's heart. Matthias looked at me one last time, his amber eyes clouded with poison and defeat, yet he mouthed a single word: "Run." Something in the center of my being, the void they called a defect, finally tore open. It wasn't a choice. It wasn't a transition. It was an awakening. The obsidian pulse didn't just flicker, it roared. The silver bars of the cage began to glow, not with the high alpha's light, but with an intense, heatless black radiation. The metal didn't break, it yielded. The silver began to liquefy, dripping onto the floor like tears of mercury as the sheer pressure of my aura disintegrated the molecular bonds of the unbreakable cage. I stepped out of the melting wreckage, the shadows of the room coalescing around my feet like a living cloak. The black veins on my skin weren't just lines anymore, they were glowing conduits of ancient power. My hair drifted in an invisible wind, and when I opened my eyes, the white was gone, replaced by a terrifying, endless eclipse. Octavius backed away, his face turning ashen. "That's impossible. No female can hold that much." "I am not a female," I said, and my voice sounded like the grinding of tectonic plates. "And I am not your asset." The room shook as the floorboards began to crack. The darkness outside the windows seemed to lean in, answering to me. I looked at Darkfur, then at Isadora, and finally at the man who had bought me. The fire was no longer a curse. It was a crown. Who is the real villain, Rogue Darkfur or High Alpha Octavius? The study was too small to contain the storm. With a flick of my wrist, the reinforced stone walls didn't just crack, they bowed outward, exploding in a rain of mortar and dust as I stepped onto the terrace. The rogue army and the Ashenvale defenders were locked in a desperate, bloody stalemate on the lawn below, but as I emerged, the very air seemed to thicken with the scent of ozone and ancient earth. The eclipse was total now, a black sun hanging over a world gone mad. I walked to the edge of the stone balustrade, my feet barely touching the ground. Darkfur lunged toward me, a roar of misplaced dominance tearing from his throat, but I didn't even look at him. I simply exhaled. A shockwave of obsidian light rippled outward, a physical manifestation of the pulse that had been suppressed for 3 centuries. It swept across the battlefield like a scythe made of midnight. The effect was instantaneous and terrifying. Darkfur, the behemoth who had terrorized the borderlands, slammed into the grass as if an invisible mountain had been dropped on his shoulders. Octavius, the high alpha who believed his blood was law, fell to his knees, his face pressed into the dirt, his regal armor cracking under the sudden, crushing gravity of my presence. "Kneel," I said. It wasn't a shout. It was a command, the true alpha voice, resonant and impossible to disobey. Every wolf on the field, friend and foe alike, collapsed. The silence that followed was more deafening than the battle. In that stillness, I descended the stairs. Isadora was cowering behind a marble pillar, her silk dress stained with the mud of the garden she had tried to steal. I stopped in front of her, the shadows coiling around my ankles like loyal hounds. You wanted the estate, Isadora, I whispered, the darkness in my eyes reflecting her own terror. But you forgot that the land remembers who bled for it. You are no Luna. You are a scavenger. I didn't kill her. Death was too quick for a woman who lived for status. Go to the wastelands, I commanded, the pulse vibrating through her very bones. Tell the shadows that the Moon Eater is awake. If you ever step foot on a Shenvale soil again, the earth itself will swallow you. Isadora fled into the trees, a broken, nameless exile. I turned back to the mansion. Matthias was standing on the terrace, leaning heavily against the shattered doorframe. The color was returning to his face as the obsidian pulse neutralized the wolfsbane in the air, but his expression was one I had never seen. The billionaire who had bought me, the alpha who had tried to renovate my spirit, was looking at me with a reverence that bordered on fear. He stepped down the stairs, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't approach me as a master or even an equal. He stopped 3 paces away and lowered his head, exposing his throat, the ultimate sign of submission. I bought a legacy, Matthias rasped, his voice thick with emotion. But I ended up with the goddess. Shenvale is yours, Rosalind. It always was. The resolution came with the rising of the sun as the eclipse passed. By noon, the rogue army had been dismantled, and Octavius Blackwater had retreated under a temporary truce, his pride shattered and his eyes promising a war the world wasn't ready for. I stood on the balcony of my family's ancestral home, the deed now signed not in currency, but in the authority of the pulse. The Ashwood estate was no longer a foreclosure, it was a sanctuary. Felix Wilehart stood in the garden below, leaning on his shears. He didn't smile, but as our eyes met, he dropped to one knee, a silent acknowledgement that the prophecy had finally found its voice. I looked out over the sprawling forests of the Northern Territories. For the first time in my life, I wasn't running. I wasn't defective. I was the first of a new kind. But as the wind shifted, carrying the scent of pine and distant wood smoke, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. Deep in the tree lane, far beyond the perimeter fence, a pair of glowing violet eyes watched the house. A silhouette taller and leaner than any wolf I had ever seen, shifted in the brush. A voice, carried on a frequency only I could hear, whispered through the shadows of the eaves. The pulse has started. Wake the others. The High Council is coming. Should Rosalind build her own pack or try to lead a Shenvale? Let me know your theories below.